please call the roll. We're going to open it up as a subcommittee while we have members show up. So we'll have our first sign-in person. Mr. Nazarian. Senator Nazarian, please step forward.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. AB 970 fills gaps in the Labor Commissioner's authority to make low-wage workers whole in wage theft cases. This bill clarifies the Labor Commissioner's authority to cite an employer and recover wages owed in two instances: one, for failure to pay the local minimum wage, and two, for failure to reimburse an employee for all necessary expenditures incurred by the employee directly related to his/her duties as required by existing state law. This bill states that the Labor Commissioner shall not issue a citation if the local entity has cited or has initiated an investigation for the same violation. This bill does not apply to employers complying with the law. A failure to recover wages on behalf of the worker after a citation has been issued will result in the worker bringing a separate claim before the Labor Commissioner. This adds unnecessary new costs and adds delays for workers who deserve full compensation. So with that, I respectfully ask for your support on the bill and have a witness joining me, Mr. Mark Schott, on behalf of the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation.
Good morning, Chairman and members. Mark Schott with California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, sponsors of the bill. Millions of dollars are stolen each year in tool and equipment charges made against workers, which are very common in the underground economy. As the Assembly member says, workers can recover these illegal deductions in a separate civil lawsuit or in a Berman wage claim hearing, but the Labor Commissioner unaccountably has no authority to issue a citation for this violation when she finds it in the field. We close this enforcement gap, we think that there will be many more workers who will recover these illegal deductions, and as the Assemblyman also stated, will correspondingly reduce the pressures on the courts and Berman hearing claim process to process these. Similarly, the Labor Commissioner has been hearing in Berman wage claim hearings in jurisdictions with higher minimum wage ordinances, claims for failure to pay those higher minimum wages. Workers also can sue to recover these higher minimum wages in a separate lawsuit, but the Labor Commissioner cannot cite when she finds them in the field, even if the local jurisdiction is not investigating the employer for that violation or has not cited them. We think these two gaps need to be closed. We'd ask for your support.
Great. Thank you. Any other witnesses in support?
Mr. Chair and members, Caitlin Vega for the California Labor Federation, also here in support. As Mr. Schock said, this really is about closing gaps in enforcement and ensuring that the Labor Commissioner has the tools she needs when she's able to do these in some processes but not in others. This is more efficient to just have standard across the board where she's able to enforce these very essential minimum wage guarantees. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other witnesses?
Savina Tacker with the Consumer Attorneys of California in support.
Great. Before we begin with the opposition, Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Mendoza?
Here.
Mendoza here. Stone?
Here.
Jackson? Leno?
Here.
Leno here. Mitchell? We have a quorum.
Great. We have quorum. Now, any opposition to this bill?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Jennifer Barrera on behalf of the California Chamber of Commerce, and we are opposed to AB 970. With regards to the enforcement of jurisdictions that have a local minimum wage law higher than the state, there are already enforcement mechanisms in place for those local jurisdictions. So it's not that these employees are without a remedy if the employer in those local jurisdictions do not pay the local minimum wage. With regards to the double penalty that I know that the author has tried to address in the language, and in reviewing the language this morning, I want to just say that it's not in my letter, so I'm not trying to blindside you with this, but the issue is that the Labor Commissioner can't cite an employer if the local jurisdiction has started an investigation or has already addressed the enforcement mechanism. But from my perspective, there's nothing in the language that says that the locals cannot thereafter cite the employer for the same violation, even though the labor commissioner has already investigated. So I still think there's an opportunity there for a double penalty, a double jeopardy kind of situation where you have an enforcement mechanism at the state level, and then you can also have an enforcement mechanism at the local level, and so the employer is now being subjected to double penalties for the same violation. Additionally, the Labor Commissioner's Office is solely funded by employer assessments, so anytime you enlarge or expand the jurisdiction of the Labor Commissioner, you are increasing the annual assessments that employers have to pay for that agency. And from our perspective, for employers that live in jurisdictions in which there is not a local minimum wage ordinance, they do not feel it is a fair assessment for them to have to pay to enforce a local measure that isn't benefiting them or affecting them. Now, I know the argument before was stated that, hey, there's a lot of bad actors through the state that do state violations, and the Labor Commissioner has to spend more time in certain areas of the state to enforce the state requirements than in others, and is that a fair thing? Well, all state labor laws are applicable to all employers throughout the state, so you can make the argument that if they're enforcing in one jurisdiction, or there's a group of bad actors in one jurisdiction of the state that are violating state laws, and the Labor Commissioner has to spend more time there, that's the benefit for all employers because it's leveling the playing field and they're getting a benefit out of that. However, with a local minimum wage law, you're not getting that same benefit because employers in a different part of the state aren't getting any benefit for the enforcement of a local issue. And so when you increase those employer assessments for employers who aren't required to pay for that local minimum wage, it's an unfair increase in cost to them. The third thing that I wanted to raise is with regards to the citation. First, they raised that this is already happening in Berman hearings, and I'm not aware of any authorization in statute that allows the Labor Commissioner to enforce it even in a Berman hearing. But with that said, when you put it in the citation process, the appeal right from a citation is different from the appeal from a Berman hearing. With the appeal from a Berman hearing, you get a trial de novo, meaning you get to start from scratch when you go to the trial court. The evidence, arguments, nothing is barred from an employer from raising new evidence, new arguments, the same arguments in that appeal. However, with a citation, it's a writ of mandate, which means it's a much more limited review and a limited opportunity for an employer to appeal, and so we're concerned from that aspect of, as well, and for those reasons we are opposed.
Thank you. Any other opposition? Would like to give the author of the bill a chance to respond to some of the concerns that were being brought up.
Thank you, and I will ask Mr. Schott to actually get into the details of the issue, but just for starters, Senators, I want to point out that I've carried similar bills in the nature of this one in years past, and they've all passed with bipartisan support. This happens to now broaden the scope and allow state enforcement in areas where local municipalities might not have those arms available to them. And so we did address the issue of double jeopardy, and if we need to look at it and clarify it more, I'm more than happy to do so. But the whole intent, we amended the bill in the Assembly and tried to work it out so that there wouldn't be any situation of a double jeopardy. That's not the intent. The whole issue was to allow local municipalities the enforcement of the state to be able to go after, at the end of the day, very bad actors who are willing to also not pay the minimum wage owed to their employees. And what this bill does is just expand the enforcement to municipalities who may set minimum wages higher than what the state requirement is. And that's where the crux of, I think, this opposition is coming from. And there's no issue. At the end of the day, you can always go through a Berman hearing. There was never anything that was not going to allow any business the opportunity. But I'd like Mark to continue.
Just a couple of quick points in response. With respect to the double citations, where you would have the Labor Commissioner cite and then the locals follow them up. Our litigation folks have looked at this, and I'm sorry I didn't put it in our letter, and we discussed this in the Assembly Labor Committee. There is a real constitutional problem to someone being cited twice for the same violation. And we think that the real constitutional problems are going to create an impediment to any locality or the state attempting to exact double punishment. So we think that really is not ever going to occur. It'll be too expensive to defend that kind of lawsuit, and the law, according to our folks, is clear. Both state and federal constitutional equal protection arguments would apply in this double citation context. Second, with respect to the hearing review, we're subjecting to a employer who violates a local minimum wage law to the same process that an employer who violates state minimum wage law is subjected to. In other words, and this is standard across California government, it's extremely rare that a challenge to a state agency final action is not by writ of mandate. The Berman hearing process was created in 1976. CRLA and the Teamsters were sponsors of that bill, and that process is for individual workers. They're not for workforce-wide citations issued by the Labor Commissioner involving possibly hundreds of violations. It's a more expensive process, and honestly, the history of litigation under 1197.1 shows no successful challenge to the fairness of the writ of mandate process, and we think the only players that benefit are unscrupulous employers who take advantage of this broader appeal right and really undercut the thrust of this bill to close these enforcement gaps.
Thank you so much, and we'll give an opportunity now for the senators if they have any questions to ask. Senator Daniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As has already been stated, there are prohibitions against any kind of double jeopardy already, but since the Chamber has raised this issue, I think it might benefit the bill looking at the lines 34 through 38 on page 5, where you say that the Labor Commissioner shall not issue a citation against an employer for a violation of any applicable local minimum wage law if the local entity with jurisdiction in the matter has cited or has initiated an investigation against the employer for the same violation. Might you just add, neither shall the local entity with jurisdiction in the matter issue a citation against an employer for a violation if the Labor Commissioner has cited? I mean, you could do it, just add that to it.
I would be reluctant to agree to that before talking to the locals, especially San Francisco, Oakland, and now LA has passed one. There's a serious effort underway statewide to try to address the issue of how locals will have the resources to enforce their local minimum wage laws, making it unnecessary for the state to cite. The other purpose of this language is to ensure that there's a conversation that occurs within these local jurisdiction when the Labor Commissioner goes to cite. We understand from our conversations with the division that that occurs as a matter of course, but this language will ensure that prior to the initiation of any DLSC action, there is a conversation with the locals. So if you would allow us to check with the locals and see what their druthers are. I mean, I think one of the issues that we're going to get into there is a funding stream created by local citation, which in my understanding supports some of the local enforcement mechanisms. We would not want to create a situation where the state basically is going to benefit from those citations. And I think the locals should have a chance to impact on the language. There might be a different approach that they would take.
Well, as a self-avowed non-attorney, I may not understand all of the potential unintended consequences and some of the nuances there, but that was just a suggestion I thought hit the point.
I think it's very unlikely. I mean, it's very unlikely.
Okay.
Senator Stone.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members. Assemblyman Nazarian, I have some strong concerns about this bill. In looking at the opposition, I see significant chambers of commerce. The California Chamber, as you know, the business environment in the state of California is not what I would call an attractive environment. I've been a very strong advocate of local control. We've seen minimum wage laws passed in San Francisco, now in Los Angeles. They have very capable city attorneys. We have very capable county councils. I'm worried about the civil lawsuits that could possibly occur here. Increasing litigation on the small businesses that are on a shoestring is certainly in my county and probably throughout the United States. I think we're just going to have a convoluted system of enforcement. Without a doubt, it's going to cost small businesses yet more money. Why not just let this become a local control issue? And if a municipality doesn't have the wherewithal to enforce these laws, why not just make it voluntary where they can ask the labor commissioner to intervene if they don't have the financial resource to intervene? Why saddle businesses with yet more cost, more bureaucracy, more tort at a time when many of them are even discussing amongst themselves whether they should even stay in the state of California?
Part of the intention was actually to reduce costs, both for this, well, specifically for the state by doing this. And I would hope that, again, I want to stress the point that at the end of the day, these are businesses that are not willing to comply with the minimum wage standards, whether the state or at municipal level. So if they're willing to gamble, then why should there also be further costs incurred by the state to go through a court process? Ultimately, if they choose to, there can be one. But I suspect that this will actually allow to curtail some of the costs that we would have to otherwise incur to get to the same judgment anyway.
Well, we're incurring costs because we're assuming a responsibility that really the local jurisdictions have the capability of having. So I see it as raising costs for the state, and the state's just not going to absorb those costs. What are they going to do? They're going to put it on the small businesses in your district. They're going to put it on the small businesses in my district, and it's going to make it more expensive yet for businesses to do business in the state of California. So why not let the locals have the first shot? If they don't have the capacity to take care of the issue themselves, they can certainly contact the labor commissioner and ask them to, if you change your bill, to allow them, the state to enforce the provisions of what you're trying to accomplish. But we also, nobody ever said that the justice was cheap, the democracy was cheap. If somebody's not following the rules, then there are legal ways in which you can get them to court. Certainly, if you have a lot of employers that aren't following minimum wage laws, you can have a class action suit that can be initiated locally. The state just wants to interfere so much in the local commerce that it's having just a dramatic effect on yet another mandate that the businesses are going to have to put up with. Certainly, those that don't follow the minimum wage laws are going to be prosecuted, admonished by local government, the city attorneys, county councils. But why not let the local authorities that have enacted those ordinances be the ones to enforce those ordinances and not depend on, Big Brother here in Sacramento to be levying the big hammer, and that hammer comes at a significant cost. And there's only so much the small businesses are going to take. Let the locals take care of the issue and let it be voluntary if they can't afford to take care of the situation themselves. Let them ask the labor commissioner to intervene. That'd be my position.
Two quick responses. I think it's fair to say that the language that's in the bill that prohibits the labor commissioner from issuing a citation if it's being investigated or as a result in a citation from a local is going to result in automatic consultation that will also include whether you're planning to do that enforcement. It just seems to us, the sponsors, absurd that the labor commissioner would be in a local jurisdiction. She would find violations of both the state minimum wage and the higher local minimum wage, and she could only cite for the lower state minimum wage. It undercuts the thrust of the local living wage ordinance to have folks understand that if they do what has been done in Sacramento for decades of constraining the enforcement budget of the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement and DIR, you do that on a local level, and you basically end up with no reasonable enforcement of state, local minimum wage laws by localities. The other point I just make quickly is this bill doesn't create any private rights of action. This solely deals with the state's citation authority, and that's all it addresses.
And
And
to just further, this could be the close as well, just to put your mind to rest as well. As I've proven in the past, and we've worked with opposition and have taken amendments to ensure that they wouldn't, to address their concerns. I'm happy to continue doing so.
I hope so. You've got a lot of chambers that I recognize. If the chambers are opposed and the California chambers are opposed, there must be an impact on business that isn't being addressed. So I hope you will continue to work with these chambers, but in this present form, I can't support the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Nazarian, for your
Thank you.
troubles.
Mr. Chair, I move the bill.
Thank you. You have a motion. I appreciate you bringing the measure forward. I know the laws are changing throughout the state as far as minimum wage is concerned. We do sometimes need to have an extra set of eyes in case something goes wrong enforcing those laws. With that, I'll entertain the motion that Mr. Denwood has made, and we'll go ahead and call the roll, Madam Secretary.
Motion is due pass to appropriations. Mendoza?
Aye.
Mendoza, aye. Stone?
No.
Stone, no. Jackson? Leno?
Aye.
Leno, aye. Mitchell?
Do the roll call, the roll open for other members to add on this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have anybody else in? Councilmember Levine, please step forward.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Thank you for joining us this morning. AB 251 would provide that a public subsidy is de minimis if it is both less than $75,000 and less than 1% of the total project cost. This would allow a developer, if she or he chooses to seek and or accept a public subsidy, to know if the Prevailing Wage Act will then cover the project. Currently, the prevailing wage law itself is triggered for public projects of $1,000 or more. In 2001, SB 975 created a de minimis exception where a project does not become subject to the prevailing wage law if it receives a public subsidy that is de minimis in the context of the project. However, SB 975 did not specifically define de minimis. Lack of clarity has led the Department of Industrial Relations to interpret de minimis in various ways. DIR has made determinations of de minimis on projects that have had public subsidies given to developers of up to $4.5 million. In these cases, the public subsidy is a notable amount of taxpayer investment, so it is reasonable to require payment of prevailing wages. With me to testify in support of this bill is Jeremy Smith with the State Building and Construction Trades Council.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Jeremy Smith here on behalf of the State Building Trades, proud sponsors of this bill. 10 years ago, de minimis was put in labor code and it was not defined. It was not defined in labor code because there is a legal definition that those folks involved in the negotiations at the time thought would be sufficient. However, because there was not a definition in the labor code, there's been created a loophole through which Mr. Levine touched upon one example. Many public subsidies of large amounts have been deemed to not trigger the prevailing wage. It was originally meant for something simple, like a sculpture for a park, for example, something that it doesn't cost too much money and doesn't require too much work to put in. But as I said, it's become a very large loophole through which it's caused many projects to receive large public subsidies and not have to pay the prevailing wage to the construction workers who are doing the project. For example, in Riverside County, there was a $4 million subsidy for a hospital that was deemed to not be a public prevailing wage job. There was a $317,000 public subsidy in 2008 for permit fees. Again, the DIR determined did not trigger the prevailing wage. There was a $500,000 public subsidy in 2009 on another project, an animal shelter project. Again, the DIR determined did not require prevailing wage to be paid. There are many other examples. I won't go into all of them now. We have tripled the amount, the $75,000 amount than what appeared in the Chow bill 2 years ago, Mr. Chow's bill. We are still in negotiations with the administration to find the sweet spot. And we intend at some point in the next few weeks probably to amend the bill to change that number. But we're still talking to them. They vetoed it obviously 2 years ago. They thought it was too low. We want to make sure they're happy. We want to make sure we get to the right number. For those reasons, we're happy to support the bill and urge your aye vote. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members, Eddie Bernacchi on behalf of the National Electrical Contractors Association, the California Legislative Conference of the Plumbing, Heating, and Piping Industry, and United Contractors. I'm going to echo the comments of my colleague from the Building Trades, Mr. Smith, just iterated to you, and I just want to add a couple of brief things. What this bill really does, it allows contractors to know the labor requirements that they're going to have to comply with prior to bid. And in the ever-changing world where the lines between public and private projects are becoming more and more blurred, having hard and fast rules on what is a public works project and the need to pay prevailing wage becomes much more important to our contractors. And for that reason, we are in support. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other support?
Hopefully won't be needed.
Maybe.
Mr. Chair and members, Caitlin Vega for the California Labor Federation, also here in support.
Okay. See no others? Any opposition?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Nick Camerata on behalf of the California Building Industry Association. On behalf of the CBIA, I was one of the negotiators for SB 975 in 2001, along with Mr. Ackerman seated next to me. We may be the only people in the room that were part of that negotiating team, but I want to set the record straight so at least you know the history here as to how the de minimis got in there. One of the examples that were given explicitly was that many jurisdictions around the state have an art and public places ordinance. Many of your cities and counties may have a similar requirement that whenever there's a new development, 2% of the total cost of the project has to be spent on art. We see that here in Sacramento with a recent example with the new Kings Arena, right? There's been some news about the cost of the art and who's producing the art. And one of the ideas that was brought up was, suppose a city or county who has such a requirement decides to waive the requirement and instead spend the money on affordable housing. Now, that would take that money. There is no change in the cost to the developer. It's still costing them the same amount. They take that money and put it into an affordable housing project. Now, that's good for housing. That's good for affordable housing in California. But it also comes with a requirement that that housing then be built with prevailing wages. And that helps the sponsors' members as well. So it's not as if this is some sort of loophole that was expressly contemplated. 2% in the overall total cost of the project. Now, these dollars are big, I grant you, but that's because the costs of the projects are large. And while the statute says de minimis, it also says de minimis in the context of the overall project, and that was specifically to match the art and public places requirements. There are other requirements that are like that are a percentage of the cost. But at the time, both the sponsors and we thought that was a worthwhile pursuit. So I want to have that out there so that you know it's not arbitrary. In setting a flat dollar amount sounds nice, but it simply doesn't work in the real world, okay? Because we have rising costs, we have projects that are much more expensive today than they were in 2001 when SB 975 was passed, for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into now. But at least that's the reason for it. That's the reason why we're opposed to the change in the bill. It's worked fine so far. And we just ask for your no vote.
Mr. Chairman and members, Dave Ackerman representing the Associated General Contractors. So we were in that room for several days negotiating 975 and the terms. The 2% guideline was specifically discussed during that meeting and not put into the code to give DIR, again, the flexibility to reflect a subsidy in the context of the project. We think it's worked fine. I mean, you could put 2% in the code if you want, I guess, but DIR wanted to have the flexibility to do that, and I believe in the governor in his veto message of the Chow bill last year so stated that the bill was too restrictive and the DIR needed that flexibility. We are in opposition to the bill for those reasons. We're interested in the discussions that the sponsors are having with the governor's office, but we feel that DIR did want that flexibility when the bill was originally enacted, and it has worked adequately in the context of the project. And also, last year, I believe this committee endorsed and passed Assemblyman Daley's legislation, which now requires a public agency to inform the contractor if and when a public subsidy is being made on a project, so we can make the determination of whether prevailing wage is applicable. So that bill removed the confusion that otherwise might have existed. So we ask for your no vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senators, Julianne Burrows here on behalf of Associated Builders and Contractors. For all the reasons that Mr. Camerota and Mr. Ackerman stated, we are in opposition, and note that similar legislation was vetoed, and I think the flexibility is needed for DIR to make those determinations. Ask for no vote.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
You want to wait?
Gentlemen,
Wait.
before you leave, thank you.
Can we just have one, the last opposition, just say,
Want to do that first?
and then they'll stay here.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members, Richard Markson for the Air Conditioning Trade Association, Associated Builders and Contractors of San Diego, Plumbing, Heating, Cooling Contractors of California, and the Western Electrical Contractors Association. For the same reasons, we are opposed.
Any other opposition? Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and open up to comments from the senators.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, we heard one of the proponents of the bill say that there seems to be some cloudiness with regard to bidding, whether they should be including prevailing wage or not including prevailing wage. Yet I hear the DIR says it's very flexible. It seems to be transparent to me. Can you comment on, are there issues of questions whether or not you're bidding appropriately or not, including prevailing wage, not including prevailing wage?
I don't think so, in part because, as Mr. Ackerman mentioned last year, Mr. Daley had a bill that made the requirement that we specifically notify our contractors, our subcontractors up front of whether or not it's a prevailing wage job. And the consequence of failing to do that, if it turns out to be a prevailing wage project, falls on us, not on any of the subcontractors or contractors. It falls on us, the developer. So we're the ones who will pay the penalties. We will pay the wage differences. We will pay the attorney's fees and costs. And that's not something we're looking to do, because they far exceed any benefit you could get by failing to state the right requirement in the contract.
And so if I'm understanding this right, if you're looking at a private sector project, as an example, Boys and Girls Club, the Boys and Girls Club does a fundraising campaign. They want to raise $500,000. They need $600,000 to put some modulars for kids. A city says, hey, you know what, we're going to give you $100,000. Does that now trigger, if this bill were to pass, does that trigger prevailing wage for the Boys and Girls Club to build their project?
So if the total cost is $500,000 and they provide $100,000, yes, it would. However, I would say that is $100,000 out of $500,000 is 20%.
Well,
right?
I said it would be $600,000 project. Boys and Girls Club raises $500. They come up with $100.
Yeah.
Does that trigger prevailing wage? And if it does, then the Boys and Girls Club is going to have to go out and raise more money, because the project is going to be more like $800,000 or $900,000. Not right?
This is true, but I would also point out that we're not even asking for that.
Yeah.
We're asking for maintaining a 2%. Right. So in your example, $600,000, a $12,000 subsidy should be the cap.
Right.
Okay. Did you want to?
Yeah, the way the bill is drafted, it says 1% or $75,000, whichever is less. So the magic number is the dollar amount.
Right. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other opposition? I know there's a little bit more support that just came in that would love to take in your testimony real quick as add-ons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry about my tardiness. Justin Fanzel on behalf of the California State Association of Electrical Workers, the Western State Council of Sheet Metal Workers, and the California State Pipe Trades Council. We're in full support. I guess just to take an opportunity to respond to the opposition. When we hear flexibility, we hear things like, well, this project, because it's for kids, should be built with lower quality workers and shouldn't be built with prevailing wage. That's not going to change the cost of the project one bit. In fact, it's more important that we have trained workers on those projects, whether it's in public art or a school or a dam or a road. If it's got a public subsidy, it deserves the right to have good trained workers on it and prevailing wages apply. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Chris Walker on behalf of the California Association of Sheet Metal Air Conditioning Contractors, representing 600 signatory contractors statewide. We are absolutely in support of the bill, and we think certainty when it comes to what de minimis means is important to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have to make a request to have a bigger room, I think. Any other senators want to ask questions?
Okay. Something clarified.
Sure. Senator Leno.
Thank you. First of all, I think ending any ambiguity, subjectivity is only going to be beneficial for everybody. So I think if we can agree upon that, then it's what's the magic number. And I know you're open to working with both the administration as it goes through the legislative process to find that. And it's already been amended once from 25 to 75, so proof of your open-mindedness. But I did want to clarify, because it was said less than 75,000 or 1%, whichever is less. It has to be both, as the bill is written. Just wanted to clarify that.
Great.
And we could even add a date. It's a conversation we had yesterday.
Great. Any other comments or questions? Great. Well, would you like to close?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members, and for your comments, Senator Leno. I think what we heard today, which was, I think, nicely tied up by Mr. Walker just now, is about seeking certainty. What we've seen with the de minimis contracts or projects where public funding is accepted, and again, it's something that is accepted, it doesn't need to be, that there has been uncertainty. With these public subsidies, de minimis has been defined in some of the examples that Mr. Smith gave, everything from 1.5% to 1/4%. And we're trying to seek some clarity and certainty so that everyone understands what they're doing. And I think it's better for the entire state that understanding is there. I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Mr. Levine. I appreciate the bill. I think in a certain sense, when you have so much ambiguity, it does create a lot of friction. Defining it would be very appropriate. And I do appreciate that you're still working with the administration. I think, it might be 1% now. It might go up to 2%, depending on what you come up with the governor, in the governor's office. And I share the concerns of that was brought forth. But as this bill proceeds, please let us know how it continues to change with the governor's office, because we want to make sure that it's something that's acceptable to him, because obviously it wasn't acceptable to him last year. So appreciate that. And Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
And I move the bill.
Oh, we have another question.
Did I move it already?
It's time for comments.
Okay. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes.
First of all, I very much respect my friend Assemblyman Levine, but I do have strong concerns about the bill. Local governments are struggling to provide for infrastructure, and I've heard the word ambiguity, flexible. One thing that the governor did was he said that the current practice is not unreasonable. There doesn't seem to be any complications with regard to making bids, whether we include prevailing wage or don't improving prevailing wage. Let's just be real and let's just call this what it is. We want more union jobs protected from those employers that are employing people in the private sector. And one could argue the people that are union employed are better trained. I'm not going to argue with you whether they are or whether they aren't. But this is a union protectionism bill. This is exactly what it is, to provide more business for union interests, and it's going to come at horrific expenses to local government. So let's just call it what it is. I can't support it in its present form, but let's not disguise it as anything different, because the process is clear. The governor's made it very clear that he thinks it's clear, and that's why he vetoed Mr. Chow's bill last year. So for those reasons, I can't support making things more expensive for local government that already is struggling to provide for $80 billion in infrastructure that is presently not being maintained, $60 billion in the state of California that presently isn't being maintained. So for those reasons, I can't support the bill.
Senator Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Mr. Stone's kind of perspective and summary of the bill using his lens. I would just say, because I don't want my vote in support of the bill to be framed in keeping with your perspective. From my perspective, I'll be supporting the bill because it is a workers' rights issue. It is, again, I think, indeed, who is best qualified to perform the work at hand. And so from that context, I will be supporting the bill.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
The motion is due pass to appropriations. Mendoza?
Aye.
Mendoza, aye. Stone?
No.
Stone, no. Jackson? Jackson, aye. Leno?
Aye.
Leno, aye. Mitchell? Mitchell, aye.
Ms. Levine, congratulations. Your bill is out.